Hello, welcome to the New South Wales Community of Policy Professionals webinar series. My name is Louisa Mamouni, and as host of the webinar today, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. I'm on Gadigal Wangal land, and wherever you may be joining us from, I recognise this land as Aboriginal land. You might be on Bundjalung land to the north, or Yuin to the south, or Barkindji to the west. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any Aboriginal people with us today. Margaret Crawford is the Auditor-General for New South Wales and helps our Parliament ensure the government is accountable for its use of public resources. Margaret has many years' experience in large, complex public sector organisations at the local, state and Commonwealth level, and this includes the Victorian Department of Human Services, the ATO, Roads and Traffic Authority and Brisbane City Council. Before becoming Auditor-General, she held the position of Deputy Secretary at the New South Wales Department of Family and Community Services. Margaret has worked across a diverse range of sectors, including housing and homelessness, community and disability services, road transport policy and regulation, taxation and gaming regulation, and Margaret Crawford commenced as the Auditor-General of New South Wales in April 2016. In addition to financial audits, and that is something quite substantial, 500 statutory financial audits a year and over 1,000 assurance opinions, the Audit Office conducts performance audits to ensure public resources are used effectively, efficiently, and in accordance with the law. And the topics for these are as broad as government itself: disaster and emergency response, relief and planning, school infrastructure and security of student information, homelessness, domestic and family violence, road and rail freight strategy, public transport in regional areas, Aboriginal land claims, climate policy and regional development are all on the books for the Audit Office's 3-year plan. Now, I guess it can be a bit terrifying to have work that we have been involved in reviewed by the Audit Office. But I'm always excited to see what the independent lens of the Audit Office picks up. And Margaret will be talking with us today about the role of the Audit Office and the importance of this role from a policy perspective. And I think we'll all gain a new understanding of policy development and implementation from better understanding the role of the Audit Office. And there will also be an interactive Q&A session at the end. So have a think about what you'd like to ask, Margaret. You can pop your questions in the chat at any time and I'll facilitate these questions following the main talk. Margaret, thank you for joining us. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Louisa, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining this morning. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to chat with you about how you can make the most of audits. But can I also start by, by acknowledging the owners of the land I'm meeting you today. I'm on the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal person who's joining the discussion this morning. So look, as I said, I'm really pleased to have this opportunity because I suspect that firstly, many of you may not know a lot about the role of my office and how we approach our work. Secondly, if you do know about us or have had experience of an audit, you're probably pretty fearful of that.
Just a webinar thing I'm on the next half an hour. It's not.
I was pleased, Louisa, to hear you say you're excited by an audit. I think that's probably a pretty rare thing. And the third thing is you may not have thought very deeply about the opportunities that an audit actually can offer you, or why, in fact, they're really important regardless. So at least they were the sort of perspectives that reflected my experience when I was in your position, when I was a public servant, just trying to do the best job I could do and to really trying to make a difference. But look, by the end of this morning's discussion, I would hope that you better understand the role of my office because it is fundamentally important to good government. And because it can also assist you to do an even better job than you already do. So first, what is it? So the work of the Auditor-General and the Audit Office can sometimes be a bit opaque. And that's really pretty surprising because it's actually been around for nearly 200 years. The first New South Wales Auditor-General was appointed in 1824. And the role hasn't actually changed that much over all those nearly 200 years. At its most basic, as Louisa said before, the Auditor-General and the Audit Office conducts an annual financial audit of all state government-controlled entities and all local councils. So that is around 500, 550 every year. And since about 1993, it has also undertaken up to 20 or so performance audits each year, providing an opinion on the efficiency and effectiveness of government services and programs. So it's actually these performance audits that most public servants dread. So in part, this is because we choose areas where we suspect things aren't going quite as they should be, where we can identify a performance gap. Now, this isn't just because we're mean, it's because we actually only get a fairly limited budget to undertake performance audits. And so we've got to really make the most of that budget and look to areas where we can really all learn something, where we can provide insights into how to improve how government operates. So the topics we choose are usually trying to pick areas where we think that there's already a problem. So it's only natural that you don't like to see your work criticised, especially when you are all, doing your best to deliver great policy outcomes. When you're working often in incredibly tight timeframes, you've often got limited budgets, there's competing stakeholders, you're going backwards and forwards with government ministers trying to get clarity, etc. And so it does make your job pretty hard. So the biggest criticism of performance audits is that they don't take this context into account. So just reflecting back, my personal worst experience of a performance audit was when I was in Victoria and I was the Director of Housing. And I was trying to deliver good housing outcomes in an environment that system really never has enough, can never provide enough houses for the people who want them. It's always constrained. And it sort of operates under this myth that somehow public housing and social housing tenants can pay their own way. So in that context, the Victorian Auditor-General released a very scathing report criticising my agency for the lack of a clear strategy to address decreasing supply in the face of increasing housing wait lists. Very standard audit, really. But at the time, I felt that it was really harsh and very unfair and hadn't taken into the context that we were operating within. When I look at it now, in hindsight, I think the Auditor-General at the time really nailed it. I really should have done more to formally document and articulate the problem that we were dealing with, the policy options that had been or could be considered, the scale of the spend that really would be required. Instead, I assumed that everyone knew how, the complexities of this area and that everyone knew that the government was not prepared to radically change its approach or invest in public housing. It's important, I think, at that juncture to understand that an Auditor-General is not allowed to question the merits of government policy. So performance audits do focus on how well we in agencies deliver on government's commitments, So it is, in effect, really about you and your work. So why is the role of the Auditor-General so important? The Auditor-General is one of just a really small number of independent officers that provide the checks and the balances that are critical to our Westminster system of government. I would argue that it's really a healthy thing to have scrutiny and assurance over the activities of government. Without, a trusted voice calling out system failures by elected governments, occasionally elected governments can behave pretty badly. For example, you may have noted the Commonwealth Auditor-General's recent report on the administration of sports grants. It identified, amongst other things, that published guidelines and independent assessment processes were not followed, and that on the face of it, the government diverted grants, that is public money, for its own political purposes. If nothing else, the scrutiny of this program and the debate that followed that audit report, I think, is really healthy for our democratic system of government, for our democratic processes, for the Parliament to be presented with evidence to hold elected officials to account. Again, I think this is really important. And an Audit Office report is quite different to media coverage of an issue, or even to an inquiry by a parliamentary committee. That's because an audit must be conducted according to really strict auditing standards. It has to be objective, evidence-based, and as far as possible balanced. So the Auditor-General, really can't afford to get it wrong. It's a very privileged position. So just thinking about that, like unlike you, I have no minister. I report directly to the Parliament. My term of appointment is 8 years, and it actually would take 2 houses of Parliament to get rid of me. So it's a fixed term. That's one of the protections that I have. So it means that I can be a bit freer to offer opinions on the work of government. I can't be directed. I choose my own audit program, so I'm free to pick whatever topics I feel are important. And I have fairly unprecedented access to information. So one of the great joys of this role that I discovered is that there is actually a little clause within my legislation that says if you don't give me the information I request within a certain period of time, I'm able to recommend that your pay be docked. So just remember that. I haven't used that, exercised that power up till now, but I sort of hope that, maybe during my term I get to just try it out once. So yeah, unprecedented access to information. But look, all of those privileges to ensure that I'm independent and objective do come with, I think, really strong accountabilities and obligations. So that, the Audit Office is an institution that really is there to help build trust in government, and I think that should be protected. But look, if all of that seems a little bit distant from where you sit, beyond the criticism that you might get from an audit, there are also some safeguards in auditing and some opportunities you can directly benefit from. So how do you try to make the most of an audit? As I said before, we frame our audit program around areas of greatest risk where we expect to find a performance gap. Accordingly, an audit of your area of responsibility may not always be the sort of, glowing credit that you might want for your work. But look, the result will always be better if you actively engage with the audit rather than fight against it. I guess that's easy for me to say, but it really is important. An audit engagement really does need to be closely managed. you should try to shape and really shape the scope of the audit. So you put some boundaries around it to make sure it's going to deliver what it's intended to deliver. You must make sure that the auditor gets all the information, all the documentation and evidence that you can provide, because there's absolutely no hope of us reaching the right conclusion if information is held back. Not to mention the fact that I might dock your pay. So you also should try to help interpret that evidence and documentation, because again, we're coming in cold to your area. You understand the context. You should try to help us interpret the evidence that you're providing. And most importantly, you should help us to shape the recommendations from an audit. I think there's nothing worse than being landed with recommendations that over time don't actually resolve the problem. You may have to action and report on them, so make sure that they are the right things for you to be working on. But let's be frank, the best audits are the ones done to someone else. So many times, when I'm talking to secretaries, they're really good at saying, "Look over there, don't look at what we're doing. Look at that other problem." So there are always insights that you can get from audits, and you can learn from audits done on other areas. And in our audits and our reporting, we often call out some common themes or findings. And occasionally we will publish a report that collects some of those themes, some of those findings together in themes. We did this in an audit report called Public Audit Insights 2014 to 2018. And you may be aware that my colleague in Canberra also does this. A good recent example is his report on the lessons that were learnt from past emergency responses. That was a really timely report that he released, highlighting the learnings from when we have to stand up responses really, really quickly to deal with an emergency situation. And given the sort of experience that we've had over the last 12 to 18 months, there's some really useful tips in that report that he produced. So look, almost universally, audit insights and suggestions are just good common sense. Really, the basics of good governance and good practice. I think the most obvious is keep good records. One of my most significant experiences in developing policy was, again, back in Victoria when I was in DPC. And I got the opportunity of working on the policies and processes related to legalising gaming in Victoria. So I was a junior policy officer, as I said, working in DPC, and my boss was responsible for developing the legislation, designing the business and financial model, negotiating with gaming providers and with prospective venues and the like before Victoria legalised poker machines. So, of course, that policy was incredibly controversial and a really high-risk area of work. I actually spent many months just sitting at a table in his office, writing down or documenting every decision, every stakeholder meeting, every briefing note or cabinet submission around that topic. We knew that whole policy area would be the subject of scrutiny and audit. And so it was so important to just keep great records. This was, for me at the time, it felt a little bit strange sitting doing that, but it was excellent training and also a really important protection for us in doing that work. Other common themes that our reports or that our audits draw out are things like, be clear about the problem you're trying to address, document your objectives, the options you've considered, the costs, the benefits. When you think about benefits, think about how are we going to measure those and how will we report the benefits. Consider and articulate the risks involved in whatever the initiative is and your level of risk tolerance. Taking some risks is sometimes quite appropriate. The trick is make sure that you've put that out there. You've acknowledged that there are risks and acknowledge how you're going to try to mitigate that. Keep good records of the decision that the government takes in respect of any recommendations you make and the explanation for why that decision was taken. It's these basics that will actually lead to good policy and implementation and protect you. So look, there's one last way you can make the most of an audit, but could I just say you should exercise a great degree of caution with this. I think it's fair to say that sometimes an objective, independent opinion expressed by an Auditor-General can get or can elicit a response from government that maybe up until that point government had been reluctant to move forward on something perhaps that you're passionate about. So just sometimes, as I say, that audit opinion can move your policy agenda forward a lot quicker than you might not be able to do yourself. But as I said, be careful. It's pretty hard to manipulate an audit outcome, and there's certain risks if you try to do that. But just occasionally it does work. So look, at that point, I'm going to pause. I think I've said enough, but I really will welcome your questions and any comments from your own experience. I just hope that that today can help you to understand what we do, why it is important for good government, and hopefully you can take advantage of the opportunity of a good performance audit. So Louisa, back to you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Margaret, for that introduction to the Audit Office, and I really liked your point as a bit of a history buff myself that there is a very long lineage of former Auditor-Generals who have held your role previously, and I think the steps that you outlined in terms of your advice to policy workers, being clear about the problem, thinking about the options, costs and benefits, risks, and so on, are very closely aligned with the things that policy officers think about on a day-to-day perspective. In terms of questions, if our audience, and there are quite a lot of you, would like to put some questions into the meeting chat, and then I'll facilitate the questions to Margaret. So I'm going to start, just while people are gathering their thoughts, I'm going to start off with a question about the limits of government policy. I really wanted to ask this question to the Premier, but I didn't want to put her on the spot the other day, so I'm really glad that I get to ask it to you, Margaret. You said that you can't question the merits of government policy in your audits, but how do you define government policy, and what are the limits of that?
Yeah, look, it is a really complex and challenging thing to do. Sometimes it's really hard to determine what is the actual government's policy. I think one of the best and early examples that I experienced of this actually related to the light rail, the southeast, whatever it is, the city light rail project. There was a huge debate at the time about what was the government's policy. Was the government's policy to deliver a really good transport solution to move people, from the city out to Randwick, or was the government's policy to build light rail? Now, depending on what you decide, really makes for a very different audit, really different audit. Now, doing that audit, we decided that because the government had made policy announcements before it was elected that it would build light rail, we decided that in fact was the policy, and audited the light rail project, as a delivery of a project. Whereas had we said, no, the policy really was, what's the best transport? Let's get a good transport option. Then that would have been very different, because then we would have tried to evaluate, well, would buses be better than light rail, etc. So yeah, determining that that policy, what is the government's policy, is quite tricky. And look, it's a little bit loose. And as I suppose, once I've got more comfortable in my role, I can maybe occasionally take a few liberties with that and really say what needs to be said, as opposed to feeling like I need to be restricted and too technical. I probably shouldn't say that, seeing you're recording this.
You won't tell anyone. Claire, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Margaret. It's so lovely to see that you're a real person. I was just wondering if you could explain how, if at all, we, and I suppose too the general public, can influence the topics of performance audits.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, look, before I became the Auditor-General, I had this image of the Audit Office as just sort of old men, grey cardigans, green pens. It's not quite like that, thankfully. Look, yeah, the topic selection is really interesting. And probably the thing I get asked the most really is, why this topic and not something else? But we do go through a fairly extensive, I suppose, scanning process to try to, identify a program that gets a good balance across all parts of government, but also is relevant, is, looking at topics that are of interest to the general public. We also do a huge amount of stakeholder engagement with, obviously, secretaries of agencies, with parliamentarians, whoever will talk to us, really. Getting input from the general public is a little bit more tricky, because possibly many members of the public would tend to think that we're more like a complaints agency, and that's not really what we do. We are trying to look at systemic issues in government rather than just dealing with one particular, perhaps small problem. So we do on our website call for submissions from individuals. But I guess mostly our topic selection does come from that scanning of the environment, talking to key stakeholders, trying to get balance, looking at areas of greatest risk, where is the government spending the most money, those sorts of things is how we shape the program.
Thank you. And Shay, could you come on and ask your question?
Hi, really great presentation. I've really enjoyed it, so thank you very much. It's an interesting area that I didn't know very much about before, so I've learned a lot from this talk. My question was if you've ever audited an area which you thought maybe they weren't performing very well, but through the audit you found that they were performing better than it might have seemed from the outside?
Yes, look, it does happen, Shay, and it's really great when it does, to be honest. Having worked very much as a public servant like yourselves, sometimes I get very weary of always having to be critical, because I know how hard it is and how people are really working very hard to do their best. So it is pleasing that sometimes we do find that actually things are pretty good here. I've got one on foot right at the moment, which hasn't tabled yet, so I can't talk about that, but just watch over the next couple of weeks. There's an audit report coming out that you'll see is very positive about how government managed, in part, responses to the crisis situations that we've done. So watch for that one. And yeah, look, it does happen occasionally, and it makes me really pleased when it does. Perhaps one other area, I'm not sure if there's anyone online from Destination New South Wales, but we did an audit on that, and everyone was complaining about, how random it seemed, the program to, what major events were received assistance and what didn't. That audit proved that they had really good systems in place to actually assess grants for major events, and a very good formalised process, and it was all public and transparent, so it ended up not being what we expected when we went in. So yeah, it does happen.
And now we have a question from Alison, from a local government perspective, I think.
Hi, can you actually hear me? My camera is obviously not playing the game at the moment.
We can see you and hear you now, Alison.
Oh, okay. Aren't you lucky? Thank you, Margaret, for your introduction. And yes, it's the audit process, I think, is a very valuable tool for all of us. And rather than, I liked your comments about engaging with the audit process, but from a local government perspective, particularly those councils who are in regional areas, the whole question around the rural fire services and the assets. I'd be really intrigued to see what would happen if a council rocked up to an RFS premises and said, can you hand over the keys to the fire trucks because we control them? I'm pretty sure that we wouldn't have much success. So could you perhaps shed some light on why this is something that is a repeat issue for councils? It's been mentioned a few times. I know there's been a lot of pushback from councils and probably will continue to be, but I'd be interested to hear it.
Thanks, Alison, for your question. Thank you very much. We're in my office. We say, "Oh God, don't mention the war," when we talk about RFS assets. It's one of those things. I only became the auditor of local government in 2000, just after I started in 2016, and it actually took me totally by surprise. I had no idea that the government was intending to do that to me, and. Anyway, I'm still trying to get over that. And look, one of the issue around RFS, I won't go into too much technical detail because it will bore everyone, but the issue is that we had been auditing the state's accounts, obviously, for a long time, including RFS itself. And there was a particular approach to control over assets, and the government's policy or position was that RFS, because it vested those assets to local government, it didn't control in an accounting term, and so it didn't put those assets on its books. Now, that was fine while ever I was just the auditor of state government, and then independent auditors were auditing local councils, and as you know, they had a very mixed approach to this matter. So some councils were recording the assets and others weren't. The problem becomes when I'm the auditor of both sectors, I can't say, well, on the one hand, the state doesn't control it, and also half the councils don't either. So it means that I have to I have to be consistent, and it really is a government position that they don't believe that RFS controls the assets, and so as a consequence, they must be controlled by councils. Now, I know that there are way diverse views about this. And yeah, as you say, regional councils really feel very strongly about it. So, for example, next week I'm going up north to meet with, I think, 7 councils. And we know that we're just going to walk into the firing line around that. But look, I'm the auditor. I'm not the policy maker. And, the policy maker does sit with the state. It's their policy. I audit against that. That's a bit long-winded, and sorry for those people who aren't in local government and don't understand this issue, but it's a shocker.
It certainly is. But thank you for your response.
Peter Wright, can you come on and ask your question, please?
Hi, Margaret. Thanks very much. I'm really enjoying the discussion. Government priorities are expressed in budget allocations to agencies, and they strongly influence how well an agency can perform. How do you consider budget allocations to agencies? Are they part of government policy that you can't question in an audit?
Ooh, that's a tricky question. Yeah, look, we tend to stay away from decisions about how much money to give to certain program areas, and we try to avoid using an audit to as a way of trying to get more money for certain things. You know, it isn't really, I mean, it is the decision of the government of the day how much, you know, how they prioritise their funding allocations. So we don't tend to comment on that. That said, you know, it's often, if there is a gap between what the government says it is trying to achieve and its ability to achieve that outcome due to funding constraints, we might call that out. And look, a really very current example is the audit report we tabled last week on homelessness, how the homelessness response. We did, I think, indicate in that audit that really the amount of funds sought by the department to deliver its strategy, they didn't get what they asked for, and hence they were only able to, I guess what they were able to do was slightly limited by that. That's about the closest we get, I think. We try not to be used, I suppose, to try to get a budget bid.
Okay, thanks. I won't use you then.
So just before we go to some other, change the topic entirely, Claire, who came on earlier, also asked how the Audit Office follows up on the recommendations to ensure, I guess, I don't know, to see what happens next, I guess.
Yeah, in fact, we don't, but one of the great, I think this is one of the really strong things about our system here in New South Wales, rather than the Audit Office, again, using its pretty scarce resources to keep doing repeat audits, we rely on Parliament to do the follow-up for us. So 12 months after a performance audit, the agency receives a request from the Public Accounts Committee. It's a legislative assembly committee of Parliament, and it's that committee will ask the agency to inform it how they've responded to the recommendations in an audit report. And often that committee holds an inquiry and actually calls people to give evidence as to how they've addressed audit recommendations. So that's how that works. So we might go back, we went back and did a second performance audit of light rail, but that was at the express request of Parliament to do that. But it's pretty rare that we, you know, in a short period of time, we don't usually go back.
I've got a question from Sarah Rish now. Oh yes, here she is.
Hey Margaret,
go ahead, Sarah.
Just may I ask, how do you and your office go about engaging with the opposition and crossbenchers? And is that any different to members of the Parliament? And maybe that's a great segue from the response that you just gave about the follow-up audits that the PAC gives. But in general, whether it's financial audits or performance audits. Thanks.
Yeah, it's probably fair to say that an auditor is usually more popular to the opposition than it is to the government of the day. Yeah, because, you know, often our work is calling out performance gaps. So yeah, the opposition is usually pretty interested in what we have to say and often reaches out and requests that we do certain work. Again, it is totally up to me whether I choose to accept that sort of offer or not. So yeah, it's just part of our stakeholder engagement, really. The interesting thing is if the government of the day, if a minister or a treasurer or in fact Parliament itself, if they request an audit, I am required actually to do that. And the quid pro quo, I think the risk is that a government could send me off on wild goose chases, picking topics at random to keep me away from doing the things that I really want to do. But the way that's balanced out is if the government does ask me to do something, they have to pay. They have to pay for it over and above my normal program so that I'm not diverted. And in fact, we have done quite a number of request audits, and some of them have been really strong and powerful audits. So I often say to them when they're thinking about asking me to do something, be careful what you wish for, because once they ask, it's then up to us what we find, and we don't report back to a particular minister, we report back to the Parliament. And so there's been some pretty hard-hitting request audits. But yeah, we do engage with crossbenchers and the opposition. And of course, at the moment, as you all know, the Legislative Council is very active. So we do give a lot of, are asked to provide evidence to a lot of upper house inquiries at the moment as well.
It's a very interesting space to watch. We now have Sasha. Would you like to come on and ask your question?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Margaret. I suspect quite often, I guess, departmental responses to audit findings and recommendations are driven not only by the report itself, but also by the emphasis the media might put onto it and public and stakeholder perceptions based on this media reporting. I guess assuming many people might just read the media, but not the report itself. How do you manage, what do you see are the risks with that, and how do you manage that as the Audit Office?
Yeah, wow, Sasha, that's it's really interesting. We always are talking in our office about how do we have impact, how do we get the best benefit from our work? And some of our people do equate media coverage as impact. I personally don't, because you really struggle to, I suppose, control how the media interprets our work. So I don't use that as a good measure of success, because often a story will run and it'll go in a totally opposite direction than it should. And we don't tend to get out there and engage with the media, because we believe that our client is the Parliament. We speak to the Parliament, and the report should speak for itself. So we don't get involved in the debate. Having said that, sometimes it's helpful. Sometimes you're going to get a better response to your audit if you do get media coverage. And yeah, look, it becomes quite political, of course. The thing is, an auditor is, there are so many protections that mean that our work is not like a media report. It is actually based on evidence. We have to follow standards. We have to be independent and declare our independence. So you are getting a product that must hold up, really. It would be a terrible failing of an Auditor-General if ever we, really got it badly wrong. So, just dealing objectively with the audit and its findings really should protect everyone, I think. Get the best out.
Thank you.
Angelique, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yes, hi, thank you. Thanks for your time. It's been very enlightening and given us some good food for thought as policy professionals. So my question was around, when we think about policy, we often do our best to make sure we're giving informed advice based on, the best evidence at the time and the best analysis that we can do of the issues. But of course, often we do so in a very time-constrained and politically constrained environment, and there are probably things that in hindsight we'll be able to say we could have done better. So just interested in your thoughts on the policy process and whether there are some common mistakes that you pick up in how it's done and that you look for in audits.
Yeah,
thanks.
Great question. Thank you, Angelique. Yeah, look, it goes back to those basics that I referenced before. Certainly, it's never a perfect world where you're at. There's always going to be political influences, diverse opinions. You're trying to walk a line. All I'd say to you is just make that as transparent as possible. So again, document your thinking and your processes, you know, document the options that you've considered, the risks associated with them, the costs and the benefits. Just do all of that transparently, and then it's totally up to the government of the day, to make its own decisions. And if you follow that sort of good process, then we're not going to be that critical. We won't criticise you. We might say you didn't, you know, the outcome wasn't fantastic, but at least we'll say, but you had gone through that proper process of thinking it through and documenting it. That's really the best you can do, I think. Yeah, it won't be that, you know, governments are imperfect things, but we can all, you know, do our best to give them the best information to work with, and that's really what an audit is looking for.
Thank you.
We've also got people who would like to work for the Audit Office after hearing from you, so that's very good. You didn't realise you were in a recruitment drive, but I think that's an effective use of our time today. And Peter Ryan, I think we'll have a question from you.
I note that you obviously do your financial and your performance audits, and I suppose my question is with regard to the performance audits, going in and seeing similar opportunities to improve program delivery repeatedly across different agencies, etc. I suppose two questions. How do you gauge the impact of your performance audit work generally in terms of its impact on government and our improved capability? And secondly, is there a forum or a means by which you engage with government to capture and drive these common learnings to generate a more systematic and enduring uplift?
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Just on the first one, in terms of measuring impact, it's really hard. It is really hard. It becomes quite subjective. Like I mentioned before, the media. Is media coverage a measure? I don't think so. Government action against, you know, on our recommendations, I take great pride when I can see things improving because of that. But, you know, how you actually measure that, and whether it's as a result of our work or some other incidental thing, is really hard to pinpoint. But we need to do better in trying to demonstrate that. Now, your second question about how we share, I don't think we do enough of that, and after today I might go back and encourage our people to do a bit more of it. Partly we don't, because we're not funded to do that. We're funded very, very specifically to get audits done, and we don't have, you know, cash to then stage other events. But we should do more, and I think we're due for another one of those sort of omnibus type reports where we just try to call out the key findings over the past few years. I think we're due to do one of those to try to help. But yeah, we probably should talk more broadly, engage more with the sector.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, and just Louisa, just on your point about working for the Audit Office, I'd encourage it. Look, one of the things I did in preparation for today is I asked my office to just count up how many performance audits I've actually tabled in the 5 years I've been the Auditor-General, and it's actually quite close now to 100. Now that's 100 incredibly diverse topics, you know, just over such a broad range that you get a really deep understanding of. And I just think what an incredible privilege to be able to look across the whole of government, to be able to get, as I said, all that information made available to you to understand what's going on. It's just the best job I could ever imagine.
How do you, with such a diverse range of topics, how do you manage to have all the people to cover and have expertise on those topics?
Yeah. So actually our performance audit team is pretty small. I think it's probably around about 30 individuals. And so clearly they can't be experts in all the matters that we audit. But what they are expert at is the auditing process. They understand the standards. They get trained to be sceptical. They get trained in how to analyse and extract information. So while they're not expert in the subject, they become expert auditors. And we've got a really very diverse team from varied backgrounds. When we need specific expertise, sometimes if we're doing a big infrastructure audit, we'll try to buy experts. Just to give us some guidance, make sure we're not missing the point totally. But no, we really rely on the expertise of our team just to do great audits.
That's fascinating. I didn't realise what was involved behind the scenes. Now we have time for probably one or two more questions. We'll see how we go. Megan, Cody, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Sure, thanks Louisa, and thanks Margaret, it's been very insightful. So my question is around a lot of the work that government does today involves commissioning, partnering and working through non-government bodies. How do you audit those activities and how does it differ, I guess, to what you normally do? And what are the challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. That's a real bone of contention for the New South Wales Auditor-General because, as you say, these days, more and more government are working through non-government agencies or the private sector to deliver programs that in the past they would have done themselves. And so that really does start to erode my mandate, put some limits on what I can look at. And in fact, now New South Wales is the only audit office in the country that doesn't have the power to follow government dollars. So to follow the dollar to ensure that government spend is delivering what it set out to deliver. So that is quite contentious. So all we can do is we audit the process that the agency sets up to manage a contract or to manage a grants program. So we're only looking at one aspect of it. We're not able to see how effective that really is. And that is a bit of a sore point.
Do you think a change is on the horizon, like similar in other jurisdictions? Do you think it will be something that will evolve?
We've been banging on about this all the time I've been in the role and well before me. And even though sometimes, you hear parliamentarians say, the Auditor-General needs this, I'm not holding my breath.
Okay. Thank you.
I guess it's just, like no one really likes an audit that much. Yeah.
Well, I think you've changed a few minds and perceptions today. Thank you.
So I think we're drawing to the end of our questions and it's been a really fabulous and interactive Q&A session. I felt like Margaret was definitely in the hot seat. I'm not sure what game show that was, but but it was, how many questions on auditing can you answer in 60 seconds? Just to finish up, I really wanted to thank Margaret for demystifying and explaining the audit process. And I think we all feel a lot more familiar with how auditing works now and how we can be involved in a positive way when auditing is focused on our area of work. And also, I think some good practices, regardless of whether our policy areas are being audited or not, good practices to do anyway in terms of record keeping, being clear about what the options are and the risks and consequences of taking various policy options. So thank you, Margaret. And on behalf of the community of policy professionals, I want to thank the Auditor-General, Margaret Crawford, for taking the time to speak with us today and our audience for your interest and enthusiasm in policy. I'd also like to thank Oscar Johnson and Vanessa Gill for supporting this webinar. And we'll be back after the school holidays on 20th of July with a panel discussion on policy skills as you progress in your career, which I think will be fascinating to look at how our policy skills need to develop from graduate level through to secretary. I'm sure we'll all make it there one day. So until then, take care.